Hello, this is Malcolm Bowden. I'd like to talk to you on the subject of the Earth being in the centre of the universe. But before I do so, I'd like to make two introductory comments that will have a bearing on what I say later. The first is, what would you think of a university that refused to teach 3 important experiments to its students in astronomy or physics or anything to do with those technical subjects? Further, what would you think of the whole university, all the universities around the world who also refused to teach any of their students these 3 very important subjects simply because they would drastically change our understanding of what this universe is alike, how it is built and how it is working? That's the first point I'd like to make. These 3 experiments have been hidden from their students for 130 years. The second thing I'd like to introduce to you is a scenario. I want you to imagine that you're in a small boat in the middle of a huge lake. You can see all the mountains and the trees around the perimeter, but it's a long way away. But not far away from you is a huge liner, and you're in a small boat. And you notice that this liner, compared with the background, is going round you regularly, and you can see how frequently it is going round you. Now you know the distance to this huge liner, therefore you can work out what speed it is going round you. Let's say it was 30 miles an hour. Now you are looking at this liner and it suddenly dawns on you that perhaps it's not the liner going round you, it is perhaps you are going round the liner. And you cannot tell which way round the motion is going, whether it's the liner going round you or you going round the liner. But there is one very simple thing that you can do, and that is, all you have to do is to put your hand in the water. If you feel the water rushing past you, and you can see that it is about 30 miles an hour, then it's pretty certain that the liner is stationary and you are going round the liner. But what happens if you put your hand in the water and find that you are stationary, you are not going through the water? This would surely indicate that it is the liner that is going round you. Now that's a little scenario I'd like you to remember when we are developing this subject a little further. There were 4 very important experiments carried out in connection with our movement in the sun and the stars. One of them is very well known. The other, as I say, have been carefully hidden away. The one that is really well known is the Michelson-Morley experiment. Michelson and Morley set up an experiment with 2 long tubes at right angles to each other, and they passed light backwards and forwards in these 2 tubes, one at right angles to their direction and one in the line of the direction of their movement around the sun. They carried out this experiment over many months, making hundreds of recordings, and to their astonishment they found that they were not going round the sun at all. We were in fact pretty well stationary, it seemed. We were expecting to measure a speed of about 30 kilometers per second, and the highest measurements they got were around about 10 kilometers per second, down to something like 1 or 2 kilometers per second. Nothing like the 30 kilometers per second that they were expecting. This threw the whole of the scientific community into complete chaos. They simply did not know how to handle this particular factor, that we seemed not to be going round the sun. So they very quickly rushed out, you might call it, and invented what is known as the Fitzgerald-Lorentz contraction. And they claimed that perhaps one of these long tubes was shortened when it was going at right angles to the direction of motion. and that compensated him for the shortening of the readings that they were getting, that these readings were not as big as they should have been because there was some problem with the equipment they were using. It was a complete invention. A few years later, Einstein produced his theory of relativity, and where we could measure the speed of the Earth going through the atmosphere, through the ether, then he just simply got rid of the problem by abolishing the ether. Now that is the only one of the 4 experiments that indicate that we are not going round the sun, but the sun, the moon and the stars are in fact rotating round us. Let me look at the other 3 experiments. Now, a few years before the Michelson-Morley experiment, in 1871, Airy, who was the Astronomer Royal, carried out an experiment to see whether we were moving through the ether and the starlight coming down the telescopes was stationary and it was we who were doing the moving, or whether perhaps we were on a stationary Earth and it was the starlight passing across us that was producing what is known as Bradley's experiment, in which if you have a vertical tube of telescope pointing directly upward to a star, then the light, and the star was stationary, then the light would come straight down through the centre of the telescope and be registered in the eyepiece. Now, supposing you started moving the telescope at, let's say, 5 miles an hour, and therefore, in order for that light to be still registered in the centre of the telescope, you would have to tilt your telescope in order to allow for your movement as the starlight is travelling down through the telescope. And let's say that at 5 miles an hour you had to tip your telescope forward about 5 degrees. Now let's consider the possibility that it's not the telescope that's doing the moving on the Earth, but it is the starlight coming in at an angle because it is the starlight that is moving with the ether as the ether goes past the telescope. Again, you would have to, if it was the same speed, you would have to tip the telescope by about 5 degrees in order to register that starlight in the centre of the telescope. However, you can't tell when the telescope is tilted at 5 degrees whether it is the telescope moving or whether it is the starlight moving. But there is one very simple change that you can make that checks out whether the telescope is moving or the star, and what you have to do is just simply fill the telescope with water. That slows down the starlight through the telescope very much more. Now, if it is the Earth that is moving, you would then have to tip the telescope from, let's say, 5 degrees and increase it more to 10 degrees because it's now travelling slower as it moves down the telescope, and you would have to tip the telescope a little further. But if the starlight is already coming in at 5 degrees and it is simply slowed down, you don't have to tip the telescope any further, and therefore you can find out whether the telescope is moving or the starlight. And Airy filled the telescope with water and compared it with previous measurements of the same star, and he did not have to tip that telescope any further than in the previous set of readings when the telescope was without water. And that showed very clearly that it was not the telescope that was moving, but the starlight and the ether was moving relative to a stationary telescope. Now, because he didn't get the results that was expected, it was called Airy's failure. And the interesting thing is that if you read his report, it is very short, and there is not a single mention of the significance of that experiment. It is purely talking about the various accuracies of the experiment that he made. Nothing about the amazing conclusion that comes from Airy's failure, i.e. that it is the telescope that is stationary and the starlight coming in at an angle, which doesn't change when you fill the telescope with water. The second experiment I want to talk about was carried out by Michelson and Gale in 1925. They set up 4 tubes in a big rectangle in a field in Chicago and tested as to whether the Earth is rotating at the so-called 24 hours a day. To everybody's surprise, and again it's one of those experiments that is not often referred to, hardly ever, they found that they could record that the ether was moving across the face of the Earth within 2% of the calculated figure of 24 hours per day. Therefore, either the ether is going past the Earth and the Earth is stationary, or the ether is stationary and we are turning inside the ether. That is the surprising result, that they measured it within 2% of the expected value. Now, in 1905, Einstein produced his theory of relativity, which got rid of this problem of the ether, and he just simply abolished it. The problem was it made so many difficulties for the physicists and the astronomers that in the abolishing of the ether, he made himself a very complicated and really quite self-contradictory theory of relativity. However, in 1913, Sagnac carried out a simple experiment in a laboratory. He had a turntable and he passed a beam of light clockwise round one way and another beam of light anti-clockwise round the other way, and then compared them when they came back to the measuring centre. And as he turned this table at only 2 revs per second, he found that he could measure the fact of the light travelling in different directions, recorded different fringes, that is the way they measure them, on his experiment, easily showing that frankly there was an ether and that the light had to go with it or against it as it travelled round the turntable. And this ultimately really completely demolished the theory of relativity, which had already abolished the ether. From Sagnac's experiment and many others carried out like it since, the ether clearly does exist, and it is a framework against which we can see whether we are moving against that framework of the ether or not. And therefore the result that Michelson and Morley got, that we were not travelling round the sun at 30 kilometres per second, is absolutely valid. We are not travelling around the sun. Now remember that those 3 experiments that I have spoken about are never ever taught in universities anywhere around the world. Now some people may say, but isn't there some clear evidence that it is the Earth that is doing the turning in the ether? And they would point to the pendulum, which if it was suspended over the North Pole and was swinging backwards and forwards quite freely, then it would be seen quite clearly that the Earth is turning underneath the pendulum. Similarly, they point to the bulge at the equator and say surely the Earth is bulging at the equator because of the centrifugal force that extends it at the equator slightly more than at the North Poles, at the North and South Poles. Surely this indicates that it is the Earth that is doing the turning. Now there is a factor known as Mach's principle, because he pointed out that the stars, although they are millions of miles away, there are billions of them, and they are very large and very heavy, and they have a very big effect upon the gravitation and the movement of various the winds in the air and other aspects like the pendulum and the size of the equator being larger than the distance between the poles. And what is really happening is that as they rotate round, it is they that are pulling on the pendulum and upon the equator and are causing what are known as Coriolis forces that occur on the Earth. there is no clear evidence that it is really the Earth that is doing the turning. In fact, that situation was investigated by two mathematicians, and they found that if there was a solid sphere inside an external sphere, hollow sphere, and that external hollow sphere was turning, it produced exactly the same pendulum effect and the centrifugal force on the equator that we have on the Earth today. It is the rotating of the stars with all their mass that pulls the pendulum round and creates the bulge on the Earth's equator and causes the Coriolis forces that give us our north and south cyclones and anticyclones for our weather systems. So again, what seem to be proofs of the Earth rotating can be explained in a perfectly normal situation otherwise. Another objection would be saying that surely the Sun, if it's going around the Earth once every 24 hours, it would have been flung out to the outer limits of space. It would have been speeding off into the atmosphere, into the universe. But again, there is another perfectly acceptable understanding of what is really happening in the universe as we see it today. And that is the factor that the ether is extremely dense. Very dense indeed. It's known as Planck density. And it is actually at a density of 3.6 times 10 to the 97 power grams per cubic centimetre. That is an enormous density, but we can go through it without noticing it at all. Rather like a swimmer underneath the sea has enormous pressure upon him, and yet is still free to move his arms and his legs and swim through the water. The pressure, in the same way that the density has no effect upon the swimmer, and the density of the ether does not have any clear immediate effect upon this Earth and upon us moving through it, around the Earth. And therefore, the Sun, the Moon and the stars are rotating around the Earth, very much like corks in a flat pan of water. The corks are floating on the water, and their weight is negligible compared with the density of the water. If you turn the water round and start to stir it round the centre, those corks will go round with the water. They just simply cannot help themselves, because the water sweeps them round because it is so much denser than the corks. In exactly the same way, the planets and the Sun and the stars and the Moon are rotating around us, being basically swept by the ether as it goes round us. They have their own movements between themselves, so that the planets are still circling the Sun, but the whole system is sweeping round us every 24 hours every day. So you can see that there is another simple explanation of why the Earth does not get flung into the far distant reaches of the universe. As Christians may say, well, what does the Bible say about all this? Well, two things. First of all, every single reference to the Sun always is in the form that it is the Sun that is doing the moving. The Sun is said to be rising in the east and setting in the west, and then it hurries round to come back to where it was before. Every reference refers to the Sun doing the moving. Now people may say, but that's just accommodating to the visual appearance. But surely God is truthful in his word. If he wanted to indicate somehow that it was the Earth that was doing the turning and even moving round the Sun, surely he would have indicated that somewhere in his perfect word, the Bible. But there is not a single reference to the Earth moving. Secondly, how do you accommodate the difference between Genesis 1, in which the earth and the heavens, notice it's plural, heavens, that's I think the physical heavens, and the spiritual heaven at the same time. How can the earth have been created on day 1, and yet the sun, moon and stars were not created until day 4? What was the earth doing in those 3 days between its creation and the creation of the sun on day 4? Did God have to give the earth a shove to push it round the sun so that we have the system that we have today? Surely not. Surely it is God's plan that the earth is the centre of not only the universe but of his great attention, because that is where this human drama, and I call it the drama of the universe, was to be played out. Man was to rebel against him, but he was prepared to send his son down here to die for our rebellion against him. This is truly the centre of his attention, and I have no hesitation in believing that the sun moves round the earth. And therefore there is a perfectly good explanation why the universe is as we find it today. The very dense ether takes those planets and the sun and the stars around with it as it moves around the earth, which is the very centre of God's attention. It always has been, and it always will be. I hope you found that interesting. Thank you for listening.